Look, no one's perfect. We all make mistakes. You, me, our wives. There's always things we could do better or do differently. But when everything you do is wrong, the constant criticism can eat at a sense of our self-worth. And today I want to talk about how it's okay to set boundaries around this. Welcome back to the Secure Husband Podcast. Bruce Abbott, certified professional coach and founder of SecureHusband.com. All month long, we're talking about boundaries here on the podcast. On the first episode, we talked about why boundaries matter, especially if you are an anxious, preoccupied husband or a fearful avoidant who leans anxious and you are married to a dismissive, avoidant wife. And last time we talked about boundaries around sex and the pain of a sexless marriage. Today, we're going to talk about criticism. If you go back to the podcast series on the dismissive avoidant wife, a dismissive avoidant wife has a tremendous amount of shame, has a tremendous amount of deep defectiveness. They feel that there is nothing they can do right, that deep at their core, they are a failure. And that's why when you bring things up about, let's say, a sexless marriage or anything that's a critique, even when it's loving and constructive, they take great defensiveness to this. But one of the things that we talked about too is this sense of a tremendous amount of criticism towards you because they're having to deflect that inner shame. And that is hard on a man's confidence and can eat at his sense of self-worth and self-respect over time. And that's why a lot of men feel like, I can't do anything right. Nothing I ever do is right. That they're constantly being corrected, constantly judged, constantly told what they should have done better. So it wears on you. And of course, then you start second guessing yourself. You start walking on eggshells. You start trying harder and harder to avoid upsetting her. And you know how that goes. The harder you try, the more criticism you seem to receive. So there's a pattern that I see when it comes to criticism. And it's very prevalent in the anxious, avoidant marriages. Anxious men will tolerate criticism for years. They don't really understand, number one, the difference between feedback and criticism because they blur together because of how our nervous system takes that feedback or criticism. And they don't understand what a healthy boundary around criticism looks like because there's a tendency to internalize every negative comment. But if you can't hold boundaries around criticism, it's going to eat at you and you're going to slowly lose that sense of self in the marriage. So let's start with the criticism. What does this look like? It can come in all shapes and sizes. If you're cleaning the kitchen and she points out the one little thing you missed and you're like, well, I cleaned the whole kitchen and you found that one thing. Or you plan the date and she's like, this was not a great restaurant. This is not I don't like this. I didn't like the food here. I didn't like or you try to help with the kids and she's correcting how you do it. Those things are so common, but also we see this in when you're expressing a need or expressing a feeling. And she's telling you why you're wrong. This feels like rejection. It hits hard because you feel like, okay, I can't win for losing here. And so we try harder. We walk on eggshells more. We try to be more careful. We try to anticipate every need. And still something ends up being wrong. That's the pattern that I see when I talk to guys who constantly feel like they're criticized. She critiques you, you defend, she escalates it, you try to explain, and she criticizes more. You get into that cycle. Eventually you do. You feel rejected. You feel defeated. Criticism over long periods of time, it just erodes a person's nervous system. Criticism, the reason we talked about this showing up so much in this dynamic is, again, going back to the dismissive avoidant woman and how she tends to protect herself through distance and control. Criticism is one way that distance gets created. If someone criticizes you a lot, it places them in a superior position. They become the judge and jury. They become the evaluator. You become the one on trial. You're the one evaluated. This creates emotional distance and control. Again, a lot of this is subconscious, the reasoning behind this. Again, go back and check out the podcast series on a dismissive, avoidant wife. It's not malicious. It's a pattern. It's a learned pattern. It's a self-protection mechanism that your wife learned when she was a child, but it is still painful. And if you tend to lean anxious, you're going to try to respond by, again, trying harder and earning that approval, which reinforces the dynamic. And so you become the one constantly seeking validation, and she becomes the one constantly giving the criticism. Now, this goes beyond just giving feedback. It's an imbalance. It's a tremendous imbalance. And anxious men will tolerate it because part of you believes it. Maybe growing up you had a critical parent. Maybe you were taught that love had to be earned, or you were the peacekeeper in your family. So when criticism appears in your marriage, your nervous system goes into a repair mode. You try to fix it. You try to explain, try to correct it, try to do everything perfect. Because if you can improve yourself, but what happens is, of all the reactions, not one of your reactions is, hold on, wait a minute. This dynamic is not healthy. You internalize it. You make it about yourself. Again, it starts to become part of your self-worth. I can't seem to do anything right. I am a screw-up. I am a mess-up. And it makes you even more vulnerable to the criticism. Now, before I start talking about the boundary here, let's make something very clear, because I can already see the comments that are going to be coming back. My husband is just too sensitive to accept feedback. Not all feedback is criticism. I get it. Healthy feedback, though, has a different feel to it. Healthy feedback would be like, hey, honey, husband, hey, I would appreciate if we could handle that differently next time. Do you sense the tone there? Hey, babe, the part of this situation was difficult for me, or I felt hurt when that happened, or I really would love it if you would do this instead of that. There's a warmth to it. It's feedback that's helpful coming from a place of love. Criticism has a different feel. The tone is very different. Criticism is, you always mess this up. Husband, you never listen. You should have known better. You don't do anything right. That's not feedback. That's criticism that attacks your character. Feedback is gentle addressing of behaviors. Hey, I would love it if instead of doing this way, would you do it this way for me? And most of the guys that I work with, if your wife came to you and asked you or gave you feedback with that kind of tone, 99% of you guys would be like, oh, okay. Yeah, that's fine. Because we want to do things right. It's not that we're wanting to not do something the right way. Now, the right way, maybe your way is a little different than my way. My wife loads the dishwasher very different than I load the dishwasher. But we both understand that, hey, unless one or the other wants to be 100% responsible for always loading the dishwasher, as long as those dishes get clean, we're fine with who does it their way. That's healthy. That's where feedback comes in. Feedback's good. Feedback actually builds connection. It builds respect. It builds trust. But criticism creates defensiveness. When criticism is constant, it just wears you down. When criticism goes unchecked for years, several things happen. First of all, you completely lose your voice in the marriage. You stop speaking up because it feels pointless. And if I do, it's just going to trigger an attack, a withdrawal, or some sort of emotional reaction from your wife. But also resentment builds, and you're keeping score. I know you are. But attraction, polarity dies. Attraction's not going to grow in an environment of constant evaluation. And your nervous system stays activated. That's that hypervigilant. You're always anticipating the next complaint. You're anticipating the next verbal jab. That state of mind, that state of tension, always living that way in your nervous system, it's exhausting and it drains the life out of the relationship. It just chokes it. So now let's look at what a boundary around criticism might look like. First of all, it is calm. It is not getting reacted. It starts with nervous system regulation. Everything in this podcast series around boundaries starts with nervous system regulation, because if you can't regulate your nervous system, you're not going to hold a boundary. It has to start with calm, and it has to be simple. It has to be consistent. What does that look like? Hey, babe, I'm open to feedback, but I'm not willing to be spoken to with criticism. That may have made you cringe because you're already picturing your wife's reaction to that. But what did that feel like in your nervous system? Again, going back to the whole nervous system podcast series, to be able to say that, you need to be able to speak that and hold the blowback. When you get that blowback, babe, I'm open to feedback, but I'm not willing to be spoken to with criticism. And if that criticism really kicks in, well, then you make the boundary a little stronger. And it's not always necessarily with criticism. It could be something like, hey, babe, if you've got something specific you'd like done differently, I'm open to hearing it. But just criticizing me isn't helpful. You notice that you're not attacking. You're not being reactive. You're just defining how you're going to participate. Remember, boundaries are not about trying to get your wife to do anything. Boundaries about what's okay for me and what I'm going to do about it. And if the conversation escalates, well, then another boundary may be disengaging. Hey, babe, I'm happy to talk about this later when we can both speak respectfully, but I'm not seeing that right now. We need to take a few minutes to cool off. That's what you say if all of a sudden it's just like a verbal vomit of criticism comes screaming at you. You step away. Not angry. You don't go slamming doors. You don't go quiet and withdraw and just shrink down. No, you calmly exit the dynamic. That's a boundary. Holding the boundary consistently is the tough part. That's where the nervous system regulation has to be there. Because the first time you do this, it is not going to feel comfortable. When you have lived with that criticism for years, your nervous system's going to freak out when you tell her that I'm not willing to be talked to like this. Your nervous system will go into panic mode. And when it does that, you're going to want to explain yourself and you're going to want to smooth things over because you don't want to prove that you're the bad guy. But boundaries require restraint. They require calm repetition. You say it once, you maybe say it one more time if needed, and then you disengage if that pattern continues. But you're not doing this aggressively. You're not punishing, but you are doing it firmly, lovingly, but firmly, just like you would with a child. Healthy parenting, sometimes you need to be firm yet loving. As a parent, it's the same situation here. Because over time, people are going to learn how to interact with you based on what you tolerate. They will treat you how you let them treat you. And I talk to guys all the time. The phrase that I hear a lot is the death by 1,000 paper cuts. This is more like a death by 1,000 corrections, I guess. So you get, whether it's how you load the dishwasher, how you speak to the kids, how you schedule things. Sometimes, men, we get criticized how we relax. You catch all of this criticism and you spend years trying to prove that you're a good husband, but that criticism never stops. When you can work in that boundary, it's going to be uncomfortable, but just sit in the discomfort and just keep it simple. When the criticism starts, hey, babe, I'm open to discussing some specific things, but I'm not going to stay in a conversation that turns into criticism. And if she escalates it, if she accuses you of being defensive, if she accuses you of being defiant, you stay calm and restate the boundary if you need to. And then again, if it escalates, then you disengage. Over time, what's going to happen is, first of all, the trigger is going to be less intense because your nervous system is being regulated. And when the criticism starts not triggering you and you're able to set a boundary every time that it happens, eventually the criticism will reduce. And if it doesn't, well, then you take the boundary to an even higher level. It may mean some dramatic changes in the relationship. If you can hold these boundaries, most of the time the criticism starts to reduce because the dynamic is changing. You stop playing the role of this constantly corrected husband. And a lot of what I've talked about here are external boundaries, but if you remember from the last couple of podcasts, we have internal boundaries that go deep inside. We have to stop absorbing every negative comment as truth. This goes back to the idea that there's feedback and then there's criticism. Because some men have a hard time accepting feedback. Some men have a hard time if their wife does come and say, babe, I wish you would do it this way. So sometimes that does happen. But also, remember, not every criticism is also accurate. Not every complaint that she has is a valid complaint. And frankly, not every frustration that your partner expresses belongs to you. Because sometimes criticism reflects their own stress or their own wounds or fears or dissatisfaction. I have a lot of flexibility in my work. And if I had an open slot in my coaching sessions and I wanted to go to the gym in the middle of the day, that would trigger my wife. And so my wife would get frustrated with me. When we would have these conversations, she would just express, well, it's just because I'm jealous, because my work doesn't have the flexibility that yours does. So that's a criticism that's reflecting their own situation. There's times where it really doesn't have anything to do with you. And that's where you can kind of lovingly say, I understand, babe, yeah, I get it. This is something that's triggering to you. But there's not anything that I can do about it. Your job is not to carry every single one of these emotions on your shoulders. It's just to stay grounded. Stay grounded in who you are. That inner boundary that you have, that you're going to stop absorbing every negative comment as criticism, is powerful. It's like a semi-permeable wall. So you're able to let feedback in when it's constructive and it's delivered in a loving way. And okay, I'm willing to listen, but it's also solid enough to hold steady when the criticism is unfounded or doesn't match the task at hand. If somebody's screaming at you because you stacked the coffee mugs the wrong way in the counter, the criticism doesn't fit the task at all. And that inner boundary that you have is going to be so important. It's powerful to do that because if you can stop collapsing emotionally, again, criticism's going to lose that grip on you. It's going to not be so triggering. You have to do some work inside on being able to understand that the difference between feedback and criticism. Like I said, 99% of the time, most men that I work with are open to that. They understand when they're giving constructive feedback versus something that's critical in a demeaning tone. But there are guys that I work with where any constructive feedback triggers them. And that's tough because that's a characteristic of dismissive, avoidant wives. They have a hard time even with constructive feedback because of that sense of shame, defectiveness that they have down subconsciously. And so any kind of constructive criticism is seen as, I'm a failure. I'm not doing this right. I never will. So boundaries around criticism doesn't mean that there's not going to be conflict. But again, if you can stay calm, hold your boundary, stop over-explaining, stop absorbing every piece of feedback, you begin to claim your self-respect. Again, you're not trying to punish or dominate your wife, and you're not trying to be narcissistic and stubborn and it's my way or the highway. You're not trying to silence her voice if she's giving constructive feedback. But if it is unfounded criticism with the biting tone, that's another story. And you just simply refuse to participate in those patterns that erode your dignity. If criticism has been a constant part of your marriage, I feel for you. We don't shame, blame, or guilt around here. I get it. You're probably worn down and probably have a lot of self-doubt. But boundaries will help you rebuild your core, your center. You just got to do them one calm thing at a time, one disengaged argument at a time. One moment of self-respect at a time. And then that core, that center strengthens you, become more grounded, more confident. And you can hold those boundaries on criticism and bring peace into your marriage. I hope this podcast has been helpful for you. We are working on boundaries all month long. And if you're not a subscriber, would you hit that subscribe button? If you're a regular listener, would you give me a review? That helps the algorithm. Helps other men find this podcast for their own healing. And if you need help, if your marriage is struggling, I encourage you, visit securehusband.com. There's a form on there for a free 30-minute consultation. It's just a conversation. There's no sales pitch, nothing spammy, just to see if one-on-one coaching might be right for you. And I'll see you on the next Secure Husband podcast. Thanks for listening.